Hey everybody, Big Toad here and welcome to my studio. In this video, a continuation of painting in Idaho Butte and foothills on a 6x3 MDF board. I'm going to be working on Sagebrush. Let's go ahead and get started. As you can see, I've already started on the Sagebrush and I'm bringing you in about halfway through. It was a lot of work to get the Sagebrush done, so I didn't want to have you sit through the entire process. Now, as you can see in a previous video, if you'll remember, I started the Sagebrush by putting in the dark greens and then a couple different layers of greens. And Sagebrush is an interesting plant. It grows pretty abundantly in the higher deserts of Idaho, and it's going to range in the colors from the darker greens to almost bluish greens that are really light, like you're seeing here in the Sagebrush. So, and it has a lot to do with the light, maybe the time of year, the water that Sagebrush gets. I don't know, but they range in colors quite a bit. So in order to create some contrast within my painting, I wanted to bring out some of the grayish, purplish hues in the Sagebrush and some lighter, paler, almost white greens. So you'll see me going here with some very, very light greens, keeping the chroma down on those greens. I don't want the chroma to be high greens at all. Sagebrush aren't high in chroma, but they do have a variety of colors within them, depending on how the light hits them and such. So they can be the darker greens like I started with, but you'll also then travel through some lighter greens all the way up into the very palish light greens that we see here, some bluish greens, and even some very light, almost gray with little purplish hues in them. So they're very, very interesting and sometimes difficult to paint in order to catch the effect of them, because people aren't familiar with sagebrush so much if you don't live where sagebrush are abundant, where everybody knows what a pine tree looks like because they're prevalent throughout so many different artist paintings. Let's review the colors I'm using in this video. They are going to use yellow ochre, which I used in the original greens. I am going to use Naples yellow, which I also used in the earlier greens. I'm also using both cad yellow light, cad yellow medium, again, which I've also used in previous videos for the greens. I'm using more titanium white here than I have throughout the rest of the painting, mainly because I needed to really lighten up these colors and get them to be a little more neutral and less chromatic, and really soften those greens up so I get a very, very pale green. If you zoom in here, you can see I'm also putting a pale green in there, as well as that kind of grayish purplish color, which leads me to dioxazine purple, which I can mix out of alizarin crimson and ultramarine blue, but I prefer it right out of the tube sometimes, and I don't use a lot of it, just a smidgen of it goes a long way when I'm creating kind of purplish hues in there. So I do put that purple into some of the greens and some of the grays here in order to just in some cases it brings the chroma down, in other cases it gives just a slight warm touch to it going down the purple range. I've also, in some of the darker areas, I'm using that dioxazine purple straight from the tube right in there, and just small little smidgens for highlights of purple, because sagebrush do tend to have some purple in them. And I'm also using that dioxazine purple and putting in just a bit of ivory black to darken it up more. And I don't use a lot of ivory black. I hardly ever use it, but I did use some here. I just wanted to get an extra punch to that purple. I mixed up quite a big piles of each of these colors. The grayish purplish, the very light greens, and I had 2 or 3 light greens mixed up, a couple different grayish purples mixed up, and just a slightly darker green. I didn't want to go too dark, already had lots of dark in there. And so I mixed up pretty good piles of these so I could dip into them and using the broken color method create some vitality within these sagebrush. It's important to notice that I'm using an impasto method, as I often do, where I'm putting paint, loading up my brush pretty heavily and putting the paint strokes on with right into the colors before it. Again, I'm not waiting for anything to dry here. Sometimes the colors do mix a little bit on the palette, on the painting as I put them in, but that's okay. That just enhances the method and the look of the sagebrush. And when using the impasto method, you have to be aware of the paint that's on your brush. And I often wipe the brush off screen into a paper towel, taking the excess paint off. The brush I'm using is a size 6 natural hog bristle brush. And almost every stroke I'm making, I'm laying that brush on its side and pulling it in various directions to create this random look of the plant in the sagebrush and how it grows. And painting the sagebrush in this way did take time, about 2 hours worth of painting time, but it's one of the focal areas. It's a very large painting, so you have to be dedicated to a little more detail than maybe you would in a smaller painting, where it allows you to make bigger brush strokes comparable to the size and the proportion of it. But in this large painting, it's going to take a prominent place in the home, so I needed to create some places within the painting that had more detail for focal areas and such. And this is one of the main ones. This sagebrush is important to set the painting off. It's going to be a portion of the painting where you're going to draw into the painting first is right around this sagebrush, the fence posts, the road that's near it, and so this has to have some detail in it to catch the eye. So I may have been able to find a looser way to do this sagebrush, but this is, I think, as loose as I want to go with it, because again, it is a focal point, and I think it captures the essence of the sagebrush well. And so I'm happy with the way it turned out. I'm happy with the direction I've gone. One of the other things I want to make sure I do when I'm working on sagebrush, especially something as high vocal as this, visually dominant as this is in the painting, is the randomness of the shape. I want to be careful not to just make it look round and feel round. And so you'll see me stretch out some places and add protrusions off of the ends and such to give it a little more random feel to it. So I don't want a smooth round ball of a sagebrush, which I've seen in paintings, and they can look really nice, but that's just not the way most sagebrush are. They're raggedy, tough looking creatures, a sagebrush is. And a sagebrush that ends up being just round has not been out in the wild, has not been in the high mountains, has not been beaten with rains and snows and winds and survived small range fires and such, been chewed on by a herd of deer, anything like that. And so I have seen some pretty nicely shaped sagebrush, but those are the exception. I've seen them in like subdivisions where they, the landscaper planted of sagebrush here and there, and they do turn out nice and round and pretty sometimes, but not so much in real life. So a more jagged, random look is what you're after, and I hope I've captured that here. It may be a little more structured than I wanted it to be, but add some length here and there to some of the branches and such to do that. The trunks are very gnarly on a sagebrush. I may do some more work on the trunk as I move forward. After this video, the main focus of this was to work on the body of the sagebrush itself. Now, I've chosen to emphasize the more grayish, light pale greenish with purplish hues in this painting specifically to offset all the yellows I have, and it also ties it in more with the sky. And as you're doing a painting, you have to think about that. What colors can you use, and how's that gonna fit in with the rest of your painting? And so I wanted this contrast. I wanted this to pop out and catch the eye pretty quickly. And so this seemed like the right direction to go with the lighter colors here for giving me a nice contrast to suck you in. And because it's lower chroma, it's really the light colors that are pulling us in rather than something brilliant and bright, which is what the grass is. So the contrast here is in the chroma and the colors itself. I'm going to go ahead and put this on fast forward. The rest of the painting of the sagebrush is pretty much the same process and procedures that I've been using, same type of brush strokes and the same color mixtures, just trying to put them in there randomly with precision. So when I say randomly, I mean that loosely. I want it to look random, but I'm also trying to be aware of the color patterns I have and where my darks are and the lights are. To give the sagebrush a fullness and a shape to it so it doesn't look flat. I'm going to do a couple different things here. I'm putting in some darker colors in there to create, again, depth and shadow within it. I'm also working on putting in, with this rigger, some branches, some random branches here and there of the sagebrush. You'd be able to see into the sagebrush, especially this closer one, and see where branches are sticking out. So I'm not trying to overwork them, just laying the brush on there, loading up some dark brownish blackish color and laying in some branches around the sagebrush to help give it some more reality. Putting in branches like this can really add some great vitality to your painting, and it can feel good and they can look good, and they look so good you can put too many in if you're not careful. So be aware of that. Do not overdo the branches. You probably want to have fewer branches in your painting than you would see in nature. All right, I think that about brings us to the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you learned something. And for now, this is the Big Toad, and I am out.